In this half hour of the show, we're talking about books, and Spencer Stuart is here. He's our books expert on North by Northwest, and he talks about publishing history. This month marks the 85th birthday of a publisher you've probably got represented on your bookshelves somewhere, Penguin Books. It also marks 50 years since the death of Penguin's visionary founder, Alan Lane. Lane went into publishing straight out of high school. It was the family business. He started Penguin as an imprint of another publisher, Bodley Head, and the idea was to publish high-quality books in affordable paperback editions. It wasn't immediately a popular idea with Bodley Head's top brass, and here Spencer picks up the story.
The board was quite opposed to it. The idea of paperback books were seen as kind of pulp and fiction, seen as kind of a lowly format of book. But what happened is Lane thought, no, this is a possibility to keep the production costs down and provide everyday people with really exceptional books, good writers, current events, because you could print them relatively quickly, and you could really tap into a market of eager readers
who couldn't afford the hardcover versions necessarily.
That's right. Yeah, and that was something that was really getting in the way of making these ideas accessible to a readership. It's funny, there's an origin story of Penguin itself that Lane was on his way to see Agatha Christie, and he was in the Exeter station desperately looking for something to read, and he was in the newsstands, and there really wasn't anything. And so the story goes that at that point he was thinking, if we had paperbacks, that would be a possible way to get these books out there. And so that's one of the stories. The one that's often not talked about is in 1934, the year before the creation of Penguin, there was actually a conference in Oxford of English publishers to talk about expanding readership. And one of the suggestions at that conference that was really repetitively dealt with was paperback as an alternative. And there was already an example of this in Albatross books in Germany, based in Hamburg in the 1930s. And I've often thought that was kind of interesting, Albatross, Penguin,
yes.
Birds, all of that stuff. Why
was it called Penguin, I wonder?
There's an interview with Alan Lane that I was taking a look at in thinking about this topic, and he says that it sort of summed up the way him and his friends felt at the time as kind of, it was distinguished yet slightly flippant was the description. And, and to be, he was 33 years old when he started Penguin, and so, that kind of, that exuberance, and certainly having to deal with the board of Bodley Head, you had to be slightly flippant of their opinions, and it paid off for them. In the first year that they started out, they actually were based in a crypt underneath the Holy Trinity Church in London, and that was where they had the books piled high. And actually, they struck a deal with Woolworths, the department store, who ended up purchasing 63,000 copies of Penguin books in one order. Yeah. Which basically paid back all of the investment, that all of the money they'd put into starting the imprint.
Amazing.
And really, and by 1936 they'd created 1 million books, and so right off they knew they had a hit. And I mean, the first 10 books that they offered, they had A Farewell to Arms, Hemingway, and an Agatha Christie in there, and Dorothy Sayers, and so there were, the first 10 were really a good start, and it was, no stopping them from there.
Talk about some of the other titles over the years, and some of the other. There were the Penguins, and then there were all the different, I guess, subject lines that Penguin published too, and they were all in different colors, as I recall.
Yeah, that's right. They, and that was something that they started out relatively early in the approach with Penguin books, and Penguin's history, its development, is really also tracked along the lines of its design. It was within the context of book design. They were really they were transformative. It was to the point that you could, from a distance, you see the green, it's crime fiction. You go to there's a white copy, or cerise and white, which is travel and adventure.
There was
dark
blue for history, right?
That's right. Yeah, blue for history, like a lighter blue, and then you've got drama's red. Purple is like belles lettres and kind of letters of that sort, and gray and white, I think, is world affairs. And that really hasn't changed much. You go into bookstores now, and I know that although Penguin is now at a different manifestation, it's in a different sort of context, they still use those designs to this day. And they started that out in 1935, and moving through to right after the war, there was a big redesign of Penguin books by Jan Schishold, who was a typographer and book designer. And he set up the principles of Penguin book design, which we still know today. If you kind of see the color band, and it's in a third on the front, and the title kind of neatly put in the middle. That was kind of set up there, and it still continues, which is kind of amazing.
I love going into used bookstores where they set aside all the Penguin line separately, and you can just browse through there, and almost anything you pick up is bound to be interesting.
Yeah, and the catalog is so massive. You're mentioning the some of the titles that they've published over the years, and it just continually keeps expanding. And they were Alan Lane, to his credit, he was constantly looking around to purchase up rights for books that were interesting, or maybe he, for instance, in 1960, they published Lady Chatterley's Lover, which famously went on to see an obscenity trial in England. And when that trial was taking place, Alan Lane had a writer in the trial documenting the proceedings, so that when they eventually came out victorious, they published a book about the trial. It was sort of, he was sitting in that example. He often described Penguin as one part missionary, one part mercenary, in that, he was constantly selling books, but also pushing ideas. Penguin before World War II has often been seen as a kind of full-scale public education program to raise awareness of what was going on the continent with regards to the spread of fascism. At that point in time, Neville Chamberlain and the politics of the period was not really reacting to what was going on. And interestingly enough, the editorial board and Alan Lane felt it important to get those ideas out there.
Interesting. Gosh.
Yeah, so often they say that they talk about next to the BBC, Penguin was one of the major forms of public education for the people of England and also the world. I mean, they were able to provide affordable alternatives to people through the way that they set up their company.
What are some of the other titles that stand out for you when you think about the history of Penguin, Spencer?
I think some of the reprints of classics, like lyrical ballads, Wordsworth and Coleridge, those that. Although obviously it's not its first edition, but the way that Penguin puts it together with translations, like the best translation that they have at the time, and a foreword at the beginning. When I was getting into poetry in high school and sort of understanding the history of Western poetry, that Penguin classic was so helpful to get a sense of the context of it. And Penguin really got that. The 1960s with Penguin saw an interesting change, and at that time they hired Tony Godwin as an advising editor, and he later went on to become chief editor. And this is important because Godwin he ran Better Books in Britain, which was kind of the ground zero for counterculture in swinging London, as it were. And he came in with a bunch of suggestions for writers to pick up and books to buy the rights for. And one of the people that he really pushed was John Berger, who famously had the show Ways of Seeing, and really opened up a whole new way of interpreting popular culture in a critical lens. And some of those books that came out of the 60s, the way that they created kind of cultural criticism was really, for me, kind of very impressive and really, really interesting to to engage with. And in terms of the book design of them, the incorporation of photography into paperback, and some of the covers at that time are amazing.
Yeah, that design right through the ages, like you say, they're such pleasing things to look at, just the way it's all been thought out and put together.
And then in 1961, Facchetti hired a graphic designer by the name of Romek Garber, and Romek Garber designed what was referred to as the Garber grid. And that's what you see in a lot of the 1960s publications of Penguin. You know, it says usually, modern Penguin classics on the top. It'll have the author's name. Then there's a defined line across the sort of upper portion of the book, and then the title. And then it leaves all this space for really whatever they wanted. And so, putting photography in there and mixing it with graphic design and stuff. It's interesting to note that Alan Lane, it was kind of to his chagrin that books were going in this direction, but he understood that it was really the way that marketing for books was going. Garber talks about being actually surprised. Sometimes he would put together a design, and then it would be out on the shelves like 2 weeks later. To his horror, he kind of wanted to work on it a bit more, but they were working so fast, especially by the 60s. It's really impressive.
Why were they working so fast?
It was so unified in terms of the book production, the way that the publishing house had its editors in line and its book designers, and everyone was really optimistic about the projects. I think it just moved quickly. They had it streamlined in a really good way. It's interesting to note that during the war, coming into 1941, the access to paper stock was lessened due to the movement of the Nazis into France, where there was a lot of a particular type of grass that was used in making pulp paper. And so this led to the supply ministry in England having to do rations for the various publishing houses. Now, in order to set up the ration rates for the various publishing houses, they asked the publishers to give them their numbers of books created in 1938 and 1939. Because of Penguin's paperbacks, the way that they were made, but also the way that they could adjust the sizes of the text on the page, they've got the lion's share of the supply that the ministry was going to be giving the publishing houses at that time. And so by the nature of their format, they were able to be extremely productive and make a great deal of books on a very little amount of supply. So it's kind of that sort of speaks to the way they had a good format, a kind of unified format that allowed them to get the most out of the paper stock that they had.
And I guess part of it too, from what you were saying earlier, was that urge to be timely about, especially at certain points in time.
Yeah, I think that's a part of it that it's really wild to pick up some of the copies of those of those political commentary books that they were setting up or that they were publishing just before the war. They're somewhat technical, they've got a kind of political science element to them, but they, Alan Lane often said to his writers, write to the level of a layman with equal amount of intelligence who's not aware of your area of study. So these series of books were really worked to provide the population with a nuanced understanding of what was going on, and in a deep dive way that the editorial, that the newspapers were not able to access.
And he sounds like he was so clear in what he wanted this publishing house to do.
Because I think it really comes back to this coming out of high school and going right into the publishing industry. He wasn't an academic. He was someone who was interested in the flow of information and the ability to learn on the fly. And also, because of the nature of what he was doing at Bodley Head early on in his life, he was exposed to a bunch of information at the same time, and he was able to read a lot of different things. And I think that experience, he wanted to share that with the rest of the world. And then I think there's also just an element of he had control over the company, but he also was able to somewhat relinquish control at the same time and let people do what they wanted to do.
To trust like that, yeah.
Yeah, which is, I think that's trust in a good system. Like if you've got people around you who are very capable and inspired and also believe in the powers of publishing good content, then you can really move mountains. You can do some really interesting things. And certainly, even though Penguin changed so much after the passing of Alan Lane, a lot of the principles continue to this day. It's interesting. He passed away in the 1970s, and at that time, the editorial board told him, listen, put this into a public trust. At that point in time, the Observer, the newspaper, had done that, and I'm pretty sure now the Guardian is in a similar arrangement. And he turned out he didn't do that. And there's been lots of speculation about what would have happened if Penguin had gone into that situation. But what ended up happening was that 6 weeks afterwards, it was purchased by Pearson, which was a publicly listed company, and they were kind of a global media company. They owned the Financial Times, but they also had shares in the Buenos Aires Water Company. They weren't always entirely interested in the publishing industry, and you sort of see that slowly but surely. They changed the way that Penguin operated. Shortly after the purchasing of Penguin by Pearson, they increased the prices of the paperbacks, and they also added a little bit more of a kind of quality to the product, which increased all the costs in making it. And, slowly but surely you see Penguin change. It's gone through different shifts, and it's still considered one of the, big five publishers with, Hachette, HarperCollins, and Simon & Schuster. But in spite of all that, it continues to have an identity that you can look at a 1930s Penguin, and somehow there's a distant relative in the stuff you still see on the shelves today.
That's Spencer Stuart, our books expert, and he's also a collections expert in his work life. And he's doing a whole series now on museums in British Columbia, too. He's always up to something interesting.